Today's Parashah is 46, Ekev, because in this Parashah, Moshe continues by explaining how blessed they will be in every aspect of their life. They will not be sterile, there will be no illness or disease in their midst. Instead, all those afflictions will be laid upon the nations that hate Israel. Then, in chapter 8, verses 17 through 20, Moshe warns the people that when they enter the land and become well settled and prosperous, they are going to say to themselves, "Look what we have achieved at the work of our hands." As verse 17 says, you will think to yourself, "My own power and strength, and by my own hand have I gotten myself this wealth." That will be the time when all Israel will need to stop and realize that they're only in the land because Yahweh put them there. And they have only prospered because Yahweh gave them the ability to gain wealth and have a good lifestyle compared with what's around them among the nations. Then Moshe ends that chapter with a stern warning in verses 19 and 20. If you forget Yahweh your God, follow other gods, and serve and worship them, I am warning you that in advance today you will perish just like the nations, because you will not have heeded the voice of Yahweh your God. Those were wise words that Moshe spoke so boldly before that second generation, there on the plains of Moab, even before they'd set one foot on the soil of ISRA'EL. So how does that compare with the modern world today? Did the returnees in 1948, who formed the state of Israel, heed the words of Moshe spoken so long ago? Or did they take with them many of the practices and the ways of life of their host nations? As we have all seen over the last 75 years, Israel has continued to favor the lifestyle modeled on the democratic system of the Western world. They did not embrace the words of Torah, nor did they turn to Yahweh. Nearly all of those returnees in the first 20 plus years were secular Zionist Jews who wanted to have nothing to do with Torah or the practices of what they considered was the religion of the ancient world. Was Yahweh pleased with that mass influx of people who returned after the Shoah? As the state of Israel was not founded on the principles of Torah, but rather on a democratic model, was Yahweh pleased with his people? I think not. So can we apply the words of Zechariah chapter 1 to the modern day context, where we see in verse 12, the angel asked Yahweh Zevaot, "How long will you keep withholding mercy from Jerusalem and the cities of Yehuda?" What was the answer given? You've been angry with them for the past 70 years. Do those words match with what has happened in the modern state of Israel? Yahweh has been silent for almost 75 years that the modern state of Israel has been in existence. That is apart from 4 short periods when he intervened in the wars which were brought about by the surrounding Arab nations. Each of those 4 wars, 1948, 1956, 1967, and 1973, Yahweh stepped in on behalf of his people. Each time the IDF started on the back foot, and in each situation they conquered their enemies in a very short space of time, only because Yahweh stepped in and helped them win those wars. It was not by might nor by the power of the IDF that they won, but because of the grace of Yahweh. In each of those 4 wars, more territory was actually added to the modern state of Israel. Yet each portion of territory that they gained was still within the boundaries of the territory that was originally promised to Abraham. Israel never retained any territory that they gained beyond the borders that God had ordained that would be given to Abraham. So what does Zechariah chapter 1 verse 12 mean when it says, "You've been angry with them for the past 70 years"? How would we put those words into context with what happened in the modern Israel over the last 75 years? Do those words of Zechariah also match what Moshe said to that second generation at today's Parashah? Looking at the broader context of Zechariah chapter 1, we see that it starts with the familiar words in verse 2. Yahweh was extremely angry with our ancestors. Why? Because they kept turning up to other gods rather than following Torah of Moshe. So also, the majority of modern Israel have looked towards the West, and particularly the USA, for their support and guidance on domestic affairs. Then, verse 3, the prophet says, "I tell them that Yahweh Zevaot says this, 'Return to me,' says Yahweh Zevaot, 'and I will return to you.'" Firstly, who was Yahweh Zevaot? Who was it that was speaking these words? It was Yeshua. But Zechariah was given, when he was given his vision, it was long before Yeshua was born. So in the time of Zechariah and all the other prophets, he was known as Yahweh Zevaot. That is why Zechariah says, "Return to me." He was speaking prophetically about the return of the people to Yeshua. And that's what the portion we read in Luke chapter 3 was all about. Yochanan the Immerser was paving the way for Yeshua's ministry. But here again, they still begged off and decided to follow their own traditions rather than the teachings of Yeshua. In the same chapter of Zechariah, it also refers to 4 different coloured horses, which is an early expression of what Yeshua is going to do in Revelation. That is because what Zechariah was shown was a prophetic message about what was revealed that must later take place in Revelation. Because it is Yeshua who is now sending out those 4 horses during the current opening of those 4 first seals of the scroll in Revelation. Therefore, in Zechariah chapter 1 verse 10, the man who is standing among the myrtle trees, the one who sends out those 4 horses in the vision, is actually the same. It's Yeshua, who is now sending out those 4 horses of Revelation. So how does this all relate to Israel and the nations of the modern world? In Zechariah, all 4 horses were wandering throughout the earth, and they were reporting back in verse 11, "We have been wandering throughout the earth, and the whole earth is quiet and at peace." Now, if we relate those words to the modern world, we see that since World War II, there has been a period of relative quiet and peace throughout the whole world for 72 years between 1945 and 2017. Now that was the period of relative peace in contrast with the First and the Second World Wars. That relative peace has been due to the actions of the United Nations as a peacekeeping organization. In 1947, that the United Nations voted to establish the State of Israel. As the British Empire was withdrawing from its mandate over the territory on both sides of the Jordan River, in the areas that were known, of course, at that time as Palestine and Transjordan, they were handing over responsibility to the United Nations. Britain was withdrawing, and by May 48, the formation of the State of Israel took place. By that stage, the Green Line borders of Israel had been determined by the United Nations the previous year. Hence the die was cast. The borders had been established for that new state of Israel. However, Yahweh did not bless that agreement. Hence, the proposed two-state solution voted on by the United Nations was never ratified, and the problems between the Jews and the Arabs, who call themselves Palestinians, have continued down to this very day. So how does that fit in with the words of Zechariah chapter 1? Firstly, Yahweh remained silent throughout a 70-year period between the resolution by the United Nations in 1947 until 2017. But did anything of major consequence happen in 2017? If we think back to that year, Yeshua did not return, as we may have expected, because he said, "You do not know the day nor the hour." But many things in the world scene did begin to unravel. However, as we've seen many times throughout Scripture, changes do not occur instantaneously or immediately. Sometimes those changes can take years or decades or even centuries before fulfillment becomes complete and apparent. What sort of major shifts in world politics and structure began in around 2017? Firstly, Donald Trump became the 45th President of the United States. His inauguration began in January 20th, 2017, which caused the greatest disruption to the US democracy since the nation was formed. On the 13th of January 2017, Russia announced it would permanently leave the G8 grouping, which paved the way, of course, for its advance into the Ukraine. Brexit negotiations began between the UK and the EU in the beginning of June 2017, which has caused a considerable change in the economic tide of not only Europe, but many other nations, including New Zealand. The United States Embassy was officially relocated to Jerusalem on May 14th, 2018, to coincide with the 70th anniversary of the Declaration of Israeli Independence. That has paved the way for closer relations with the Arab Gulf states and Israel. But the long-term outcome of such reliances will rebound on Israel. More importantly, from a scriptural perspective, we see by looking again at the words of Zechariah chapter 1 verse 14 that the message that Yahweh is extremely jealous on behalf of Jerusalem and Zion. Then, in the next verse, he expresses his extreme anger, which he is harboring against the nations, who are showing contempt for his city and the people he loves. As verse 15 says, "I am extremely angry with the nations that are so self-satisfied, because I was only a little angry with Jerusalem and Zion, but they made the suffering far worse." While Yahweh is fully entitled as the God of the universe to discipline his own people and the city he loves, it is never the right of the UN or individual nations to put pressure on Israel to conform to their requirements, either economically, politically, or religiously. So Yahweh will not tolerate the present attitude of the nations towards his people and his city much longer. Yahweh says in Zechariah chapter 8 verse 3, "I am returning to Zion. I will live in Jerusalem. Then Jerusalem will be called the truth city. Yahweh Zevaot's mountain, the mountain of the Holy One." Sometime soon, Yeshua will return to Zion, along with the chosen ones, as we read in Revelation chapter 17, verse 14. And they, the 10 kings, will go out and war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will defeat them, because he is the Lord of lords and the King of kings. And those who are called and chosen and faithful will overcome along with him. As Yeshua has been on the move since 2017, and his dealings not only with Israel but also with the nations will start a complete change, which will culminate with his return. As Caroline shared in an email last night, a fox was seen running around the south wall of the Temple Mount. When? On the day of Tisha B'Av, the annual observance of the destruction of the first and second temples. The presence of a fox is spoken about both in the Tanakh and the Talmud. So its presence possibly is not untimely, because Yahweh Zevaot, Yeshua, is moving towards the fulfillment of the restoration of the city of Jerusalem. Was this a sign that things are coming to a climax? As Zechariah chapter 1 concludes in verses 7 and 8, Yahweh Zevaot says, I will save my people from the lands east and west. I will bring them back, and they will live in Jerusalem. They will be my people, and I will be their God, with faithfulness and justice. Moving on to Zechariah chapter 8, verses 14 through 16. For Yahweh Zevaot says, just as I resolved to do you harm when your forefathers provoked me, Yahweh Zevaot says, so now I resolve to do good for Jerusalem and for the house of Yehudah. Don't be afraid. These are the things that you are to do. Speak the truth to each other. In your courts, administer justice that is true and conducive to peace. Don't plot harm against each other, and don't love perjury, for these are the things that I hate, says Yahweh. Those words closely match the political turmoil that is presently impacting the whole of Israel. Do those words reflect the struggles that we are seeing daily in the Knesset and on the streets of the cities of Israel? Are those words prophecy of the beginning of the coming of Yeshua and the fruition of the time in which we live? As we head towards the time of the 3-letter Moedim, which will start in the middle of September, we need to remain awake and aware of what is happening in the world around us, and more particularly in Jerusalem. Shabbat Shalom.